Ever scroll through social media and think, man, was life just simpler before all of this? Like,
Hmm.
more fulfilling, maybe even better.
I think a lot of people have that thought.
I know I do. And it turns out there are some philosophers way back in the day who were wrestling with this very idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We're going to be taking a deep dive into the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau
Okay.
and Thomas Hobbes.
I've heard of them.
They had some pretty different ideas about human nature, about society, about what it even means to be civilized.
That sounds right up our alley.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to explore this question. Is all this modern stuff, is it actually progress, or are we kind of messing things up?
That's a big question.
It is. But first, let's get a little background on these guys, Rousseau and Hobbes, because they lived in pretty different worlds, which really shaped their views.
All right, so where do we start?
Let's start with Rousseau. He was writing during the 18th century, right in the middle of the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment? Okay.
Yeah, so that was his whole movement, celebrating reason and science and progress. Everyone was super optimistic about humanity's potential.
Like we were on the right track, finally.
Exactly. But Hobbes, he was living through a very different time, 17th century England, in the thick of a civil war.
Oh, wow, that's rough.
It was. So you can see how that might make someone a little less rosy about human nature, right?
Yeah, I can see that.
All right, so let's talk about Rousseau's big idea. He's famous for this concept of the noble savage, right?
Right, like we're all good deep down, but then society corrupts us.
Yeah, something like that. But it's actually a bit more complicated than just primitive, good, modern, bad.
I figured there had to be more to it.
There is. So Rousseau believed that in our natural state, before civilization, humans are driven by what he called amour de soi, which is a kind of self-love.
Self-love, not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Exactly. This isn't about being selfish or egotistical.
Mm.
It's more about a basic desire for survival and well-being. Like,
Mhm.
we all want to eat, we want to be safe.
Yeah, those are pretty basic needs.
Right. And Rousseau thought that in nature, we're pretty good at just meeting those needs and living in harmony with each other and with the world around us.
But then civilization comes along.
And it introduces all these new desires, things like status and wealth and power.
Ah, so that changes things.
It does. And this leads to what Rousseau called amour propre, which is like a competitive kind of egotism where we're constantly comparing ourselves to others and wanting more than what we actually need.
Oh, so like keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing.
Exactly. And Rousseau believed that this drive for social status, for having more than the next guy, is the root of a lot of the problems in society. Inequality, conflict, even unhappiness.
Makes you wonder if all this progress has really made us any happier or just given us new things to stress about.
Right. It's a really good point. And, Rousseau himself had a pretty rough childhood. He was abandoned by his father at a young age.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it makes you wonder if that experience, shaped his thinking about societal structures. Like,
Yeah.
maybe he was skeptical of those structures because he saw how they could fail individuals.
It's definitely possible. I mean, our experiences shape how we see the world.
Totally. And this kind of leads us into Rousseau's other big idea, the social contract.
The social contract. Okay, I've heard of that, but what is it exactly?
So it's not a literal contract that we sign, right? It's more like a philosophical concept about how we can live together peacefully in a society.
So like an unwritten agreement?
Yeah, exactly. And Rousseau argued that in order for this to work, individuals need to be willing to give up some of their freedoms.
Give up freedoms?
Yeah, in exchange for the protection and the benefits of living in a society.
Mhm.
Like, think about it.
Right.
We give up the freedom to just take whatever we want because we agree to follow laws, and in return, we get safety and security and all the other good things that come with living in a community.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Rousseau also said that this whole thing only works if it's based on what he called the general will.
The general will, what's that?
Basically, it's this idea that everyone in society needs to be focused on the common good, not just their own individual desires.
So putting the needs of the group first.
Exactly. And Rousseau believed that only then, when we prioritize what's best for everyone, can we truly achieve a just and harmonious society.
That's a big ask. I mean, is that really achievable? Don't you think there's always going to be some tension between individual desires and what's good for the group?
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, is it even possible or even desirable to completely suppress individual desires?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
It is. And it's a question that people are still debating today. How do we balance individual freedom with the needs of the collective? Where do we draw the line?
Right, right.
It's definitely something to think about, especially when you compare Rousseau's ideas to someone like Hobbes, who, had a very different and much darker view of human nature.
Yeah, Hobbes was way more pessimistic, wasn't he?
He was. He basically thought that without a strong ruler to keep everyone in check, society would just completely fall apart.
Like descend into chaos.
Exactly. Now remember, Hobbes lived through a really turbulent time, a period of intense civil war in England.
Right, so that probably had an impact on his thinking.
Totally. And he argued that in a state of nature, before there were any governments or laws, life would be absolutely brutal.
Like a free-for-all.
Yeah. He actually used this famous phrase to describe it. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Wow, that's pretty bleak.
It is. He believed that humans are fundamentally driven by self-preservation, and that without a powerful authority to enforce the rules, we basically just constantly be at each other's throats.
So in a way, he was saying that we need rules and laws to keep us from destroying each other.
Exactly. And it's interesting to think about whether there are any modern examples that support his view. Like when you see places where law and order break down, do things tend to descend into chaos?
I mean, you see it sometimes. Conflicts and violence erupt when governments collapse, when there's no clear authority.
Right. And even though that might not prove Hobbes was totally right about human nature, it definitely shows how important strong institutions are for maintaining some kind of stability.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
It's just fascinating how both Rousseau and Hobbes offer these completely different perspectives on who we are as humans.
And it seems like neither one of them is completely right or wrong.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. We're capable of incredible acts of kindness and cooperation, but we're also capable of some pretty terrible things.
Absolutely. That's like the big paradox here. Have all of our advancements like technology and democracy and all of that, have they actually made us better people?
Or have we just come up with fancier ways to be bad?
Right. That's the question.
And this is where it gets really relevant to our lives today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, think about Rousseau's critique of amour propre, that competitive egotism. Doesn't that feel incredibly relevant in the age of social media?
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like everyone's comparing themselves to these perfect, curated online personas, constantly trying to get more likes and followers.
It's like that pressure to keep up with the Joneses is amplified times 1,000.
Exactly. It feels like social media is feeding that amour propre in a way that maybe nothing else has before.
Makes you wonder what Rousseau would think about it all.
Right. And then you have this whole issue of political polarization, where everyone seems to be retreating into their own echo chambers.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Nobody can even agree on basic facts anymore, let alone find common ground on the big issues. It makes you wonder if Rousseau's idea of the general will, that we can all prioritize the common good, if that's even possible in today's world.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
So after looking at all of this, where do you think we land? Are we more like those noble savages that Rousseau talked about? Just corrupted by all the complexities of modern life?
Or are we, like Hobbes thought, these selfish creatures who need strict rules to keep us from imploding?
That's a big question.
It is. And honestly, I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. We have the potential for both good and bad, that's for sure.
Totally. But the real question is, what are we going to choose to cultivate? What kind of society do we want to build going forward?
That's a question for all of us, I think.
It is. So here's a little thought experiment for everyone listening. If you could design society from scratch, knowing what we know about human nature, what would it look like?
That's a good one.
Would you follow Rousseau's lead and emphasize cooperation and the common good? Or would you go with Hobbes and focus on strong leadership and clear rules?
What would you keep from the world we have now?
What would you get rid of completely?
It's really something to think about.
It is, and I think understanding these philosophical ideas, even the ones that are hundreds of years old, can help us to examine our own assumptions about the world and think about how we want to shape the future.
Absolutely. It's all about asking the right questions, isn't it?
It is.